Thank you for that very lovely introduction. It's my privilege and my distinct pleasure to have been invited here to Birmingham to speak. The topic of education has become ever more critical. Nobody needs to tell you that a lot has gone wrong in education. The atrocity at Littleton is the culmination of 35 years of psychologized schooling and parenting advice. The folks at Columbine High School got a good jolt of the mental hygiene approach to teaching, up close and personal. Social scientists' unworkable philosophies of child management have always been characterized by a lack of adult leadership and guidance. First, they told parents to lay off the discipline and let kids express themselves. They told parents not to preach or moralize. Then they said youngsters deserve privacy and that you should stay out of their rooms, not snoop in their closets or check their bureau drawers, and avoid commenting on anything that you might overhear with your teenagers' conversations on the phone. Professors at university departments of education joined in with admonishments to prospective teachers like me against putting red markings on pupils' papers and criticizing youngsters' work, their manner of dress, or their speech. Children who acted out simply needed a mental health counselor, not whiny parents. Experts explained to us that we should stop shoving our outdated moral values on our children. I think you probably remember that from the 60s and 70s. Eventually, the suggestion that parents had the right to direct the upbringing of their children was viewed as overprotectiveness. Remember that phrase. And then it was viewed as child abuse. Tolerance of bad manners, meanwhile, was viewed as okay. That was being flexible, as well as sputtering obscenities, which children now do freely. Well, we can see what this approach has reaped as pupils from Paducah, Kentucky to Littleton, Colorado, and Jonesboro, Arkansas run for cover. Today, we have human warehouses, not institutions of learning. The peer pressure approach to educating, coupled with progressively lax discipline, has unleashed what I call a Lord of the Flies mentality, which even police stationed in school hallways and on rooftops can no longer be expected to control. This result should have been predictable, especially among those calling themselves experts, child psychologists. Rocky Mountain News reported in 1994 that the Jefferson County Education Board voted to continue funding the then renamed outcome-based education. That is, psychology-based education, to the tune of $1 million over parent objections. Drug education, refusal skills, self-esteem, and relationships became the centerpieces of curriculum, pushing academics even further out of the picture. As many of you know, my first book, Educating for the New World Order, was the first to warn of the extent to which the mental hygiene movement had taken over education and of the emerging sophistication of computerized cross-matching of personal records. Had I not been asked to write a magazine article that brought me face to face with the quantum leap technology has taken in the past 5 years, I probably wouldn't have written Cloning of the American Mind. As I was penning that article, it occurred to me that even if a person understands theoretically how this new technology works, the average citizen isn't going to know how to counter a computerized psychological attack mechanism, which is what we've got going. Then I found out more than I bargained for. There wasn't just one extremist faction of behavioral science at work, but two. Which is why I tried to do something a little different. To produce a text explaining how the mental hygiene movement has generated a worldwide education crisis, but also to create a how-to manual for countering psychological profiling and manipulation that will hopefully help parents teach their children to resist subliminal indoctrination techniques. Needless to say, this was a tall order. I will be expanding upon that part of my book in the workshop this afternoon. I hope all of you can come. Once you understand that schooling today isn't about literacy or proficiency at anything or basics, that what school is about is mental hygiene, then everything else you see or fail to see in the classroom starts to make a lopsided sort of sense. Among the first phony baloney tests I saw was in the state of Pennsylvania. It was called the Educational Quality Assessment, or EQA. The EQA was given every 2 years, and for those of you who may not be familiar with today's state tests, the questions on the EQA are fairly representative. I often wish I were someone else, or I get very upset easily at home. The student is supposed to check A, very true of me, B, mostly true of me, C, untrue of me, D, very untrue of me. You are asked to sit at a table with retarded students. In this situation, I would feel A, very comfortable, B, comfortable, C, slightly uncomfortable, D, very uncomfortable. A person in a crowd is standing on a street corner. They're protesting about something. Some people pick up rocks and start throwing them at windows. In this situation, I would also throw rocks when I knew, A, there was no chance of getting caught, B, I agreed with what they were protesting about, or C, my closest friend decided to throw rocks. Notice that the unwritten assumption here is that the child will throw rocks under some circumstances. The testers want to know what those circumstances are. The EQA had 375 questions covering attitudes, worldviews, and opinions. Most involved hypothetical situations like that or self-reports. There were also 30 questions on math and 30 on verbal analogies, just to appear to be credible academically. But the majority of questions were like those I just read. The next shocker was a scoring mechanism. It revealed points were being given for what's called a minimum positive attitude. In other words, a state-desired response. After 4 years, an audit of the federal funding links to EQA, and a series of threats and counter-threats between state, federal education officials, testing authorities finally admitted that the EQA was in fact a psychological test, and that it violated several of the protected areas listed under the 1978 Federal Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. Unfortunately, like most legislation created to protect parents and their children, that piece of legislation turned out to be so full of loopholes that it was nearly worthless. The biggest problem with it, as usual, is that there were no significant penalties for non-compliance. In other words, they could do it anyway. Suffice it to say, most school tests today are basically survey questionnaires that function like polls. They run the gamut of self-reports, intimate details, and worldview-oriented what-would-you-do-if surveys that have as their purpose getting into the child's belief system and the attitudes of family members. They comprise the largest part not only of most state-standardized tests and surveys, but they subliminally encourage counterproductive behaviors and belief simply by posing the questions. Drug and alcohol surveys, for example, subtly convey the notion that wine with the evening meal is the equivalent of cocaine and drunkenness. Health questionnaires that grill students on sexual practice imply that unmarried sex and homosexual activity is normal and expected. Polls on religious attitudes encourage children to equate God with mythology and Judeo-Christian values with tribal taboos. The first blatant case of fraud I saw was in Indiana, which was using the Metropolitan Achievement Test, and that's the key. They used the term achievement. And this was put out in 1992 by the Psychological Corporation. The MAT, M-A-T, included now standard fare about how many TV programs a student watches, whether the child reads to a younger brother or sister, and how often the child shops for his own clothes. Then there were some real honest-to-goodness academic questions thrown in literally at random, asking the student the meaning of a vocabulary word or where a State of the Union is located. Surrounding these isolated instances, however, were the majority of questions. For example, is there a ruler in your house? A protractor? Are there other types of measuring devices in your house? Is there a dictionary or thesaurus in your home? The child didn't just check yes or no. This was multiple choice. A, I have one of my own. B, there is one I can use, but it isn't mine. C, I don't know if there is one. And D, no. Then, just to keep it kosher, suddenly the test is back to a couple of academic questions. Meanwhile, Oklahoma parents reported questions like, pioneers were able to survive because A, most people survive from their moral values. B, their physical being was stronger than nature. Or C, they could live off of intellectual ability. Which is the right answer on that one? Well, the point is, it's not supposed to be a right answer. What they're doing is profiling kids. And it's all the answers, all the responses taken together that form a psychological profile, not one in isolation. In most instances, multiple choice and true-false questions are asked several different ways to nail down personal and family proclivities. Meanwhile, the loss of subject matter that generations before ours were expected to learn, practice, and commit to memory has produced an ever-shrinking common body of knowledge, and with it, reliance on the electronic media for both entertainment and news, often described today as infotainment. For example, subjects like logic and philosophy are now completely unknown in America's secondary schools, thereby greatly endangering our young people's ability to investigate or even consider ideas that are at variance with government-approved ones. The darker side of this, however, is the lack of substantive tasks to occupy the child's mind and time. This mental idleness not only breeds mischief, but the psychological surveying and psychologized curriculums fuel a morbid preoccupation with self. Take this survey from Bettendorf, Iowa High School. Apparently it was used with an Understanding Others curriculum in the 1980s.